This first of two events we're doing surrounding the midterms. This is co-sponsored by the IPK and by a new series we're having at NYU called Conversations in the Social Sciences. My name's David Stasavage. I'm the Dean for the Social Sciences here and a professor in the Politics Department. I'm not going to say much tonight. I'm just going to introduce our four speakers very briefly and hopefully keep time on them so that we have a lot of time for questions afterwards. So we're going to start off with Jonathan Nagler, who is a professor in the Politics Department. I should say in advance, he has to run out at exactly 6:15 to catch a train, so when he does that, he's not being rude. Then we're going to have Mike Hout, who's a professor in the Sociology Department. Then we will have Kimberly Johnson, who's a professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, followed up by Christina Beltran, who is also a professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis with an affiliation in the Politics Department. Thank you. Jonathan?
Okay, hello everyone. Is there a presentation or something? Full screen now, presenting? Full screen. Okay. Hi. So I'm going to talk about who votes in U.S. elections. Thus, the title of this cool book, readily available. And so I literally am going to cover some of the stuff in this book that Jan Leakley and I wrote a couple of years ago. And it has a fairly descriptive title of Who Votes Now, Demographics, Issues, Inequality, and Turnout in the U.S. So I'm going to kind of just run through the basics, literally, of who votes, and then some things about why they vote. So this is just a table of, and it's hard to talk about turnout without just sort of going through the numbers, and I think it's kind of a good way to start on these things. This is literally a table of turnout rates in the United States since 1972. And so just as a benchmark for what's going on, ballpark, when we have presidential elections, turnout is somewhere between 55 and 60%. What's that turnout of? That's turnout of the voting eligible population. It's citizens over the age of 18 who haven't been disenfranchised for one reason or another, the one reason generally being a felony conviction in some states. The second column is the column that is a little bit more interesting to us in terms of what's going to be happening next Tuesday, because that's turnout in midterm elections. It is really, really, really low. Okay, I mean, generally speaking, it's about 40% of people who are eligible to vote show up. In 2014, it was actually, there was a noticeable dip. It dropped down to 36%. So this is a little bit more than 1 out of every 3 people bother to show up in these elections. Okay, this varies very predictably by demographic characteristics. This is the turnout of each income quintile level in every presidential election since 1972. We don't quite get to 2016. What you notice is a very standard story of American politics. People in the higher income bracket are much more likely to vote than people in the lower income bracket. And it doesn't change, okay? In different presidential elections, turnout might go up, it might go down a little bit, but the gap between these groups, you don't see any difference there. If you look at midterm elections, you see the same thing. It just, they all move together, we just, shift down a little bit, but nothing is happening over time. But then when you look at age, it's a little bit different. Here, these are a lot of different age groups. For those of you who have really good eyesight, you can see, hey, one group is voting more, and those are the really old folks, the 76 to 84-year-olds are more likely to vote than they used to be. But otherwise, you see the kind of sad story here that 18 to 24-year-olds are on the bottom. They've got the bottom totally locked down. And bear in mind, in 1980 was going to be the election when young people voted. 1984 was going to be the election when young people voted. 1988 was going to be the election when young people voted. They never vote, okay? They have not shown up yet. So when you get to midterm elections, it kind of looks like the same thing, okay? Young people are on the bottom. The gaps kind of look similar. But this graph is actually hiding something kind of interesting. If we look at this differently, if we look at this in terms of what share of the votes do you have compared to your share of the population? And here we're just going to look at every year from 1980 to 2012. And here we're going to start off with education groups, people with less than high school education, people who graduated from high school, and we'll look at their turnout rates. And you can see the big differences that we saw before. You can see their turnout on year and off year. But then on the far right, you see what share of the votes do they have. And you notice that it just doesn't vary from the presidential elections to the midterms. People with less than high school education, they've got 11.5% of the votes in on year, 11.3% in the midterms. It's just not changing. If we look at income levels, it's the same thing. You can look at this and say, wow, people in the bottom income quintile, they have such a small share of the vote. Like they're 20% of the people, and in presidential elections, they get 13.9% of the votes, and in midterm elections, 13.1% of the votes is what they make up. But those numbers are awfully similar. The big difference is young people. They don't vote. Okay, we got that down. So if you look at presidential elections, over this whole period, 37.8% turnout. When you go to midterms, they drop to 17.2%. They vote fewer than 1 out of 5 midterm elections. And what that does to them, if you look on the far right, is in presidential elections, these young people, the youngest group, 18 to 24, they have 9.4% of the votes. Now that's low, but it drops to 6.3% in the midterm elections. So essentially, this age group is giving up half of their share of the votes in midterm elections, totally voluntarily. Okay, they just are not showing up to vote here. And if you go to the 25 to 30-year-olds, it's not quite as drastic, but it's a stark drop-off again. They've got 9.9% of the votes in the presidential elections, 8% in the midterms. So this is kind of a big deal. Like, you wonder why presidential elections and midterm elections might be different. And one reason is these young people are not showing up to vote. And this matters because they tend to have different preferences than older people. And most of you are probably sort of familiar with this story. They are simply more socially tolerant, more socially liberal than older people. And you can imagine why that might make a difference in how they vote when they vote, but in midterms they often do not. Okay. I want to just mention a couple of other facts about who votes and then get into some things about why people vote or don't vote. Hispanics vote at lower rates than non-Hispanics. I kind of put this up there because it's both important and kind of baffling. Like, it's not exactly clear what's going on. Hispanics vote at lower rates than non-Hispanics, and even if you say, yeah, but they're younger, have lower levels of education, that's not it. When you condition on that, they still just vote at lower levels. When you think about how hard at least one of the parties tries to recruit this group, that's a little hard to understand. And it's a little hard to understand when you think of how hard the other party tries to not recruit them. You would sort of think that might motivate them also. So why don't more people vote? I'm going to talk about two things: choice of candidates, institutional rules, the voting rules, and I'm going to write choice of candidates on the slide twice because it's so important. So choice of candidates, what do I mean by that? I don't mean choice of candidates in the sense that one candidate's tall, the other's short, one candidate's a woman, the other candidate's a man. I mean, what we looked at in our research is and found is that voters who can see policy differences between the candidates, if you ask them, what do you think about, what do you think this candidate's position is on the issues? What do you think that candidate's position is on the issues? If they can tell you that, and if they actually prefer one candidate to the other, they're substantially more likely to vote. And it's worth ballpark, it might make them as much as 10 percentage points more likely to vote, which is like a lot in this world. If your turnout, if the turnout of young folks went from 30% to 40%, that's a big jump. That's a lot of votes. So choice of candidates is a big deal, and you might think of where this starts to come into play and potentially things that happen in 2018. I'm going to leave you to do all the speculation. I'm going to lay off that, but you can sort of figure where this gets into it. And the interesting part of this is it turns out that people with lower levels of education and people with lower levels of income, they're just the folks who are less likely to see the differences between the candidates. And again, if you're sitting in the audience here, you might just think, how can that possibly be? Like none of you in this room, I'm betting, have any trouble telling the difference between policy positions of Democrats and Republicans. Lots of people do. Okay, I want to just mention election laws, but I'm going to talk about 3 laws, not the laws that are the hot topic today, which tends to be photo ID laws. Until about 8 or 10 years ago, we were making it a lot easier to vote in the U.S. We were increasing the availability of absentee voting. we were increasing the availability of early voting, and we were increasing the availability of election day registration. And all these things are worth about 3 percentage points in turnout. If you implement these things in your state, turnout will go up a few percentage points. It's not going to make us look like Europe, but turnout will go up. As most of you know, is what's happened lately is a bunch of states have started to make it harder to vote by implementing photo ID laws requiring you to show up at the polls with a photo ID. Everything we know suggests that should make it harder to vote. The data on that so far is really basically limited, so there's not a lot to be said about it. Other than what we know is it's a particular set of people who don't have those photo IDs. So you start thinking about who might not vote because of that, it's not too hard to figure out. Okay, so I want to make one other point. This is where I will sort of jump into the world of speculation a little bit. So young people, back to them. Why might they vote? Well, now they've got access to social media. They could find out the candidates are different from one another. So there's an interesting phenomena that Taylor Swift posted about politics finally 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it was a really well-informed post. She basically told her followers, I guess, all 120 million of them, which is like, this is a non-trivial number of people, but it was a really well-crafted post. It was like, hey, she's voting because she hates the policies of one particular candidate. She thinks her followers should learn the policies of candidates and vote based on that. So as you can tell, based on what we say in our book, I thought this was like, yeah, that's great. That's awesome advice. Will that matter? Even from the early data, it actually looks like you saw a bump in registration because she did this in time to register. Whether or not those folks show up to vote, we won't know for another 6 months till the data comes out. But it's up in the air. Will young people vote this time? All the evidence is so far they haven't. So I'm going to stop on that point, and I believe I'm within my time.
Okay, now the trick. Oh, thank you very much. Good, I don't have to do the trick. Switching from one set of slides to the next. No, that one's not me. I'm out. There we go. All right, and once again, we want to go full screen. Great. Well, thanks very much for all of you who have come today, and especially to Jonathan for getting us started. He was talking about how predictable showing up is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how it matters for how we read the other information we have about elections, which is to say how we read polls and polling, because it turns out they're intimately connected. You hear this phrase and you read it in the footnote, this is either likely voters or it isn't. Some poll results are shown for likely voters, some are shown for others. Many of the poll aggregators switch from being the general population to excluding people they don't consider to be likely voters when they present the results. And what is all that about? So how's the polling black box work? A bunch of answers about Republicans and Democrats are dumped into a black box, and out comes a map. And the maps are predictions about who's going to win each congressional district, or in presidential elections or Senate elections, who's going to win each state. And I want to focus today on, because of our theme on turnout, on the extra part of the black box, the likely voter black box. And Jonathan's prediction models and those tables we just looked at are a version of that. They help discern who is and who is not likely to vote. And thus, if the polls include a bunch of people who aren't likely to vote, they get less weight in generating this prediction over here. And the people who are likely to turn out get more weight. And by weight, I mean just what they tell the pollster matters more for the final prediction than it doesn't. And this turns out to be quite important because of reasons that Jonathan also mentioned that I didn't think he was going to. And that is that, most importantly, the likely voter would not matter in going from poll results to predictions if everybody had the same, if it was pretty much a coin toss. If the turnout rate is if it's a presidential election and half the people are going to turn out, you just flip a coin, include half and don't include the other half. Am I feeding back here, or is that something else? Okay. And meanwhile, what really happens is that some people have more weight than others in this translation, and it can matter quite a lot in the outcome and in the degree to which polls make prediction errors. One of the prediction errors, or the polling errors, of the 2016 presidential election was that the likely voter models got it wrong. Donald Trump managed to mobilize a segment of Democratic voters who didn't usually show up. And they showed up and they voted for him, the Republican, instead. And that threw off predictions for 3 key states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Might have also thrown off other states, but they crossed the line from being in the Clinton column to being in the Trump column in reality. And that they were small errors, a couple of percentage points in each of those states, but that error in the likely voter model really did matter. Now, historically, as Jonathan also pointed out, Republicans are more likely voters. They tend to show up more often, and that might work to their advantage this time around also. But to the degree to which the new Republican model is to mobilize unlikely voters, it could very well be that, one theory is at least that by mobilizing more college-educated voters and suburban voters, the Democrats this time are actually going to increase their share of the congressional election. We'll find out on Tuesday. But if the polls turn out to be wrong, these are 2 questions you can ask yourself. Did the unlikely voters turn up, or did the likely voters fail to turn up, or did they vote in a way that they were not anticipated to vote? I want to go into one other challenge in doing and interpreting polls. I'm an unabashed polling apologist. Much of my career has been based on survey research and gathering data by, we want to know, and asking people questions that we want the answer to. And so that's part of my role here, is to convince you that this is not all junk. But it's also not all easy. It's actually quite tricky. There's this double uncertainty of what do people think, and will they show up and express what they think at the polls. But in addition, there's this geographical feature. Oh, gosh, half of my map disappeared. We'll work around that. And that is that American voting, like in a lot of countries, is geographic. But polling tends not to designate the geography. We don't know where this person in this poll came from in the national ones. And when we have local polls of specific congressional districts, those are spotty, they're patchy. The one I'm focused on here is the New York 19th, which is actually a quite heavily polled district in which we've got 10 sets of poll results at various days. But that's not what I'm showing. That slide didn't make the cut. What we have here are other districts that are paired in a statistical model with the polling that is done in the New York 19th in order to generate the prediction for the New York 19th. And also the New York 19th informs the predictions about these other 10 districts. And in fact, every district in the country slightly informs in the 538, this is the 538 model, slightly informs what is a prediction for any specific one. So here's the New York 19th. Let's zoom out and see if we get it. No, we didn't get any better. Still have serious dropout here. But here we have the New York 19th. It gets the most weight in predicting for the New York 19th, but the Maine second, and whatever one this is out here in Minnesota, and this batch of Michigan and Michigan and Wisconsin districts also weigh into predictions about the New York 19th. And when we get data about the New York 19th, it also informs what is predicted about eastern Minnesota or southeastern Wisconsin. And that builds in additional uncertainty, the connection, and it's a unique feature, or if not unique, at least it's a special feature of the 538 model, because it, the reason it generated a higher probability of Trump winning in 16 than any of the others, you know, this famous CNN "I'll eat a bug" prediction, was because that took into account this correlated errors. A polling error in one place implies there probably is a similar polling error in another place, and if the New York 19th moves to the right, all of these districts probably move to the right. If it moves to the left, all of these districts move to the left. It's watered down. You know, this is the darkest green. These are slightly paler, and it has almost no implication for what's showing out here as, you know, the ghosty mountain states. But that is all built into the model, and is something that is why can't the pollsters come up with a firmer prediction? Well, it's because we're in part working with this kind of uncertainty. First, the uncertainty of who's going to show up and vote, and secondly, have we got it right in all of these others? My favorite one of these cases is actually not showing up very well at all in this screen, but it is a correlated district with mildly correlated with the New York 19th, and it is the Colorado 3rd. And the reason it's my favorite is Diane Mitz Bush, the Democratic candidate there, was my colleague at the University of Arizona. She left academia to go into politics and has been in the Colorado State Legislature and is now in one of those underpolled. There's exactly one poll of her district, and yet the model generates a prediction in part by borrowing information from the New York 19th and elsewhere in the country. So I'm about out of time. I've got 20 seconds to tell you there's two kinds of people in the world. After all this continuous talk and uncertainties of varying degrees, I'm going to tell you there's two kinds of people in the world. People like me who are continuously refreshing 538 once an hour in order to get the latest. What are the odds on the Senate? What are the odds on the House? And then there's people like my wife who identifies with Han Solo. Never tell me the odds. And so you can choose your, if you are my wife's type of person, you can quit looking at your phone and now pay attention to our next speaker, Carmen, or I'm not sure who's up next. All right, that's it. Thank you.
So I should say that I was part of the reaction, that I've had a lot of anxiety, and I've actually decided to take a pause and have how do I do just the slideshow? So I'm going to actually take a step back and start a little bit more historically. Oh, sorry. I'm going to actually take a step back and be a little bit more historic-minded, because the way that I'm thinking about this election is not, of course, this election is an important election. All elections are important, but I'm really thinking about this election in terms of this much broader kind of political change that's occurring in our country. If this were about a decade or so ago, we'd probably use words like realigning election and things that are considered deeply unfashionable. But I think in my little sort of neck of the woods, what we're really thinking about is what does this mean in terms of these broad changes, and particularly what we're thinking about is this notion of reconstruction and redemption. So I've been making the claim in the last couple of year or so that this is a moment that, at least to me, feels like a neo-redemption moment. So by redemption, I mean this moment that occurs after Reconstruction ends, what's the development of basically Jim Crow South, this sort of massive disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South. And I bring up this chart because I think it's important for us to sort of think back, what does it mean when you have a significant portion of your electorate disenfranchised? And I think this number is startling. So we go from about 60% turnout, and this is African American men over the age of 21, to basically zero for essentially basically from about 1900 to about 1936. What's 1936? It's FDR. And then we get another point slightly higher. It's 1944, Smith v. Allwright, and the white primary is overturned. And then we get this kind of slow, steady climb through the early civil rights movement, and then the big jump happens as a result of the enactment of the Voting Rights Act. And so that's when you start getting this sort of more normalized voter turnout. And again, this is just in the South. So basically, you see patterns that we've seen since the 1970, 1972. It sort of goes up and goes up and down. But I think that given what's happened, especially since 2010, that this is a moment that we really need to think about. So yeah, this is doing sort of the weird things to maps. So this is a map of voter restrictions since 2010. So this predates, so this is sort of in the wake of, in many ways, Obama's election, but a lot of this has kind of been pushed by a variety of different groups, even before Obama's election. And it's not surprising that many of these restrictions are occurring in the Deep South, but also in the upper Midwest, and then also in the Southwest Arizona and Texas. And so in many ways, if you look at this map, it also kind of echoes in many ways the electoral map of 2016. So I want to think about what is the implication of having these various types of voter restrictions, particularly in the post-Shelby era. One of the things I'm going to argue is that we might not see, although I think a number of people have argued that we can see that impact, at least in the 2016 election, and maybe we'll see even more given what's happened in places like North Dakota and Georgia in terms of kind of issues with voting. So we might see some more effect of those voting restrictions. But I want to go back to someone who's not really spoken about very often in political science, a political scientist named V.O. Key. And V.O. Key talked about voting and politics in the South during this kind of massive disenfranchised moment. And what he argues is that, yes, the disenfranchisement is important, and by disenfranchisement, he meant not only African Americans, but he also meant whites as well, particularly white working class folks. And what he argued is that it creates a different kind of politics, a politics that really wasn't a politics for the good, but it really was a politics about personalities. It was an issueless politics, and it was a politics in which the haves managed to get a lot more than the have-nots. And so while we might think, okay, this kind of voter ID, these sort of voter restrictions, it doesn't affect me living in New Jersey or living in New York or living in Massachusetts, but it affects how we think about who the electorate is. It affects who the politicians are speaking to. It affects where the money goes. And so I think we need to really acknowledge that this is an issue for us to think about, that it's not simply disenfranchising particular groups, but that it is actually creating a different kind of politics. So this is a chart, again, this is from Pew, and this is like very odd, but you can see actually that dip, right? So the question is, was that dip the result of basically lack of enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton among African American voters? Or is that dip sort of in line with that sort of much longer trend among African American voting, which is about 55 to 60%? And so are we sort of seeing the kind of correction from the sort of overvoting, if you will, during the last two Obama elections? Or is it in fact the impact of various disenfranchising moments? So is it the impact of North Carolina? Is it the impact of Wisconsin? Is it the impact of Indiana and Ohio and all these places? And I think that's something that folks are still trying to tease out. Is it just sort of regularized turnout, or is it really the impact of these various voter ID laws? But again, I think what I want to sort of point to is that it's not just about particular groups. It's about democratic norm erosions. So this is unfortunately you can't really see it. This is a great two drawings I found from the Colored Republican book from 1899. And on this side it says, This is really kind of terrible, but I'll read it for you. On your left, it says how the colored voter is allowed to cast his ballot in a state where Democrats control the election. So it's violence. It's sort of a lack of access to the polls. And on your right, it says how he casts his vote in a Republican state. And so they're all dressed in suits, and they're sort of standing there quite sort of in a quite nicely in this kind of way of expressing sort of democratic citizenship. And again, I think what I'm really worried about, what I'm really, really worried about is the ways in which the last couple of elections has really sort of challenged what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to participate in democratic politics? This is actually voter turnout. This is white voter turnout under the sort of Jim Crow disenfranchisement. So in places like Virginia, white voter turnout was 25%. So again, when you think about these voter disenfranchisement laws, there's a knock-on effect. And so what does it mean that you have in all of these states that the average is about 25% turnout? Just it gives you another perspective. In Kentucky, it's 64%. In West Virginia, it was 92%. The U.S. average at that moment is 64%. In one report, it actually argued that there were more voters in Toledo than in the Virginia gubernatorial election of the previous year. So again, I think what I wanted to sort of add to, because I think I'm kind of running out of space, is let's think about this election not simply as what's going to happen next on Tuesday, because obviously that's important, but I also want us to think about what does it mean in this moment? How do we sort of think about democracy? How do we think about citizenship? And what are the ways that we can sort of enhance and protect our democracy and protect the notion that we all ought to participate? So thank you.
Things happen. Okay, great. So, hi. Oh, technology, it's exciting. Well, thanks everybody for being here, and I think we're all just in a moment of enormous panic until Tuesday, so I appreciate the shared anxiety that we're all kind of processing right now, because I'm one of the people who looks at 528 and, panics. So I wanted to come at this, I wanted to focus a little bit on the Latino vote, but I really wanted to talk about some larger questions around, so actually let me go to one, I just have a couple of Pew data pieces that I think are important. I wanted to talk about the fact that I think one thing we need to talk about, and I think I really appreciate thinking about this both in terms of history and trying to understand the sort of long history of voter turnout and these larger questions of democracy. And I think one thing that I'm really interested in is what has been the failure of both political parties to building an electorate? So I think for me, I'm thinking about this as a democratic theorist, right? As somebody who's thinking about democracy and citizenship and participation. I think all of us, this is a major concern of those of us who study politics, but really trying to think about what does it mean as a failure of both political parties to build an electorate rather than simply gathering up already existing voters. In other words, what does it mean to talk about turning non-voters into voters, right? What sort of political and civic project would that entail, and what is the long gendered and racialized history of that project, right? So one thing I wanted to note And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Latino voters because I think, we sort of saw what we're seeing is a certain kind of narrative about kind of the failure of Latino voters. This sort of like, why aren't they participating? What's wrong with them? Why are they not participating? And I think I'm irritated by that narrative in part because I think we have some really good reasons for why that is. And I think we have to kind of dig into the history of groups of people who've been mobilized and demobilized. And so that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about today. Because I think one of the issues is many citizens today feel like our politics are broken, right? Many citizens are disillusioned by our politics. I think one thing that's kind of interesting is that historically, I think when conservatives have been disillusioned, they go into their party. And when liberals and progressives are feeling disillusioned, they exit the Democratic Party, right? And I think this has to do with some kind of different conceptions of the political. And I think often progressives and liberals often see themselves as getting involved in the political and other kinds of spaces, in artistic spaces, in social movement spaces, in mass-based participatory or nonprofit spaces. But they've often sort of exited the Democratic Party. And I think that has ceded the Democratic Party to sort of a certain segment of folks who participate and a lot of folks who don't. And so I think, so one thing I wanted to point that out, I think this issue of who kind of withdraws and who goes in is, of course, we obviously need to be thinking about the notion of the political far more broadly than voters, right? There are a lot of people who are politically active and mobilizing and engaged who are not necessarily voters, right? And so I think one of the real issues is how do you turn people who are political, who do think about public issues, who do get involved in their schools or their churches or their mosques, and how do you get those people involved, right, in voter politics? I do think that one thing we can think about today is that the Trump moment has felt like a political crisis for a lot of people. And I think, at least from conversations I have with people on the left or liberals and progressives, there's this feeling of like, okay, we need to be in the streets and at the ballot box, right? And so this feeling that the cavalry's not coming. If we're gonna fix this democracy, we have to fix it. And that means if we don't think our electoral process is working, we have to do something about it. And I mean, I sort of see that amongst my students. I see that in a very, kind of broad way. It'll be really interesting is if we see that played out nationally, right? If we sort of see that sense of both failure and crisis and treating this as a crisis moment where people get engaged with electoral politics. But I want to talk a little about this idea of the failure of Latino voters. Because I think the real failure has been how both political parties are failing at mobilizing this population. And I think one of the things that I think we don't talk about enough is turning non-voters into voters. Turning non-voters into voters requires continual political organizing, right? It requires, and this doesn't happen consistently across states, right? And so this is one thing we know, right? Over half of Latinos, just to give, are in 2 states, California and Texas. Over half of all Latino voters in the United States are in just those 2 states. So what that has historically meant was you have a red state and sort of a state that has been not particularly focused on mobilizing folks in areas where like Beto O'Rourke is, like in the El Paso, Clint area, those parts of East Texas. And then you have states like California, which often had, is a much more available state to vote, right? You can mail in your ballot, you get your ballot mailed to you in California. It's a much more accessible state. On the other hand, I think typically candidates in California have gone to where the voters already are, right? They already pick up they're not trying to grow an electorate, they're trying to kind of grab the maximum yield of already existing voters. So this question of how do you mobilize and create a larger electorate? I'll just throw in a couple of, just some quick demographic stuff. One of the things to always think about, certainly that Latino voting power is blunted by a number of demographic factors. As folks mentioned, Latinos are a disproportionately young population. Latino millennials make up 44% of eligible voters. It's always harder to get young people to vote. And this, I think, has to do with kind of the problem of not thinking intersectionally about populations. So we talk about the Latino voter. Well, who is that Latino voter? Is it a woman over 45 with a college degree, or is it a 20-year-old Latino, working 2 jobs who did 1 year of community college, right? Like, we have to think about their class, we have to think about their age, we have to think about their state, we have to think about, are they 3rd generation, are they 1st generation? Do they have any voters in their family? Have they, so all those kinds of questions, but instead we just talk about the Latino vote in this very flat, simple way. And we need to really dig into the fact that we're talking about millions and millions of people, and we need to think about the different demographic communities they're in. It's always harder to get young people to vote. political science literature talks about the fact that who doesn't vote, and we saw this data, right? People with less education, people who are lower income, people who are younger. Well, Latinos are in all of those demographic categories in disproportionate ways. So that makes it a challenging population to mobilize. And I think the other thing is, even for those who do have higher levels of education, who are older, what does it mean to be an electorate that's been reached out to, that's been mobilized, that's been brought into the voting process? So I guess one point I want to let us think about is Trump has galvanized a lot of Latinos, and we saw larger voter turnout in states like Nevada and Arizona in 2016, right? But I think one of the ideas is that awfulness does not automatically overcome larger and demographic and structural changes, right? You do not produce, abuse alone does not produce an electorate. Abuse alone does not produce an electorate, right? You can't just punch people in the face. That's like saying you're gonna, spousal abuse makes you a feminist, right? Like just being abused, doesn't necessarily, create a kind of political identity. A political identity is something that's gonna be forged over time, and it also does require organizing and mobilizing and building an electorate. And so I think that's something we don't talk about enough, is what does it mean to build an electorate? What does it mean to turn non-voters into voters? And often that takes a number of touch points. This is one quick, just some Pew data and Washington Post data today, right? More Hispanic voters say they've given a lot of thought to the 2018 midterm election, so we're seeing higher levels of interest among Latino voters. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. This is just looking at the turnout rates in 2014. People have already shown this, that it dropped dramatically among particular populations. And again, I think that the fact that we don't even talk about the Asian American vote very much really speaks to the fact, again, that we're not really talking about mobilizing and creating electorates nearly enough, right? The fact that we don't even talk about the Asian American vote, which is going to be crucial in states like California and Hawaii, right? But the ongoingness of sort of thinking about those populations. Again, I showed you that data before. So thinking also, I think one of the issues that's really important, and this happens in the media a lot, is that we describe the growth of the population, which is different than, and so this looks at eligible voter growth. And I think it's just really important to talk about the difference between Latino population growth and voter eligibility in those states. Because sometimes people will say, well, they're 25% of, the population here, but they're like 4% of the electorate or 5% of the electorate. So it's just important to be really aware of like, where are they situated as voters? And the other thing I just wanted to point to maybe for us to think about is one of the really interesting issues around anti-immigrant sentiment out there is every Latino voter who's a voter is a citizen, right? It's sort of a no kidding kind of point. But it's a really important one in terms of when there's an assault on non-citizens. What happens? This is different than, say, when there's an assault on trans populations or LGBTQ populations who are also voters and under a particular assault. This is an issue where people are under assault, but they're somewhat adjacent to the voting, to the electorate themselves. They might identify with the people under assault, but they themselves have a sense of secured citizenship. So I think that has something really interesting to tell us about what the practices of identification are among Latino voters to Latinos as a larger population of migrants. And that has a lot to do with what generation they are, what kind of relationship they have to migrant populations, if they're in their family, if they're at their workplace, or if they really feel pretty distant from migrant populations. That's gonna have a huge impact. So I guess the last point I wanted to simply make is I think that what's kind of exciting in this moment is to think about, 2 points. I think it's really exciting to think about people like Beto O'Rourke. I think what we really need to think about is what do sort of movement elections where the candidate sees themselves as having a larger role in terms of growing an electorate, right? And of course they're doing that out of self-interest to some extent, right? They're doing that because they need new voters to win their election. But on the other hand, those are also people who understand themselves as having a particular democratic and civic project of growing the electorate. And we need those kind of candidates to create a new electorate, right? We need candidates who see themselves as organizers, as people who are creating electorates that they're committed to turning non-voters into voters, as opposed to those who are just trying to generalize and sort of just grab the yield of already existing voters, right? Because then they won't reach out to communities that have never had a candidate visit, don't get any kind of reach out, and stay increasingly isolated from the electoral process. And the last thing I would say is, it's over 57 million people, so I always hate when people are like, Latinos aren't participating. Well, here's the thing, right? We know this. Millions and millions of Latinos right now are organizing, they're in their neighborhoods, they're registering voters, they're organizing people, every state. Latinos are organizing and mobilizing. Millions of people are doing that. At the same time, millions of people are disengaged, are not part of the story, don't, feel civically connected and are non-voters. Like, those things are happening at the same time. So it would be really great if we could stop talking about Latinos as either participating or not participating. We need to develop this kind of language that we can talk about these non-voting populations and these voting populations in kind of a richer way, because the political actions there shouldn't be erased, but the problems also shouldn't be denied. So we sort of need to think more carefully about both. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, thanks to our panelists for four great insights, and also for the fact that no one went over time. So the result of that is that we have a lot of time for questions. So if I could ask the four of you could come up here, and we will have a roving mic in the audience, I believe that is. Okay, yeah, we'd like to do it by microphone if possible, because we are live streaming and recording. Not that, I hope that doesn't dissuade you from asking questions, but would anybody like to take the first question? We do not have a wireless up here. Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll come around to you.
Outreach to Hispanic voters in New York City. We did outreach to New York State voters, and then I noticed it was number 4. It's as though nothing has changed except the internet has changed all of us. So my question is, your points are not that new, but the internet is new.
I'm going to give Jonathan the first crack at that one, because he's the co-director of the Social Media and Political Participation Lab here at NYU, so that means you better have a good response.
Media, you can read the New York Times on the internet, and it's easier to do it now than it was when you had to go out and buy it. Or we can talk about social media and how people choose their news. And so now lots of people get news via their Facebook feed, and it's particularly true of young people in terms of what they look at. Lots of it is going to come through their Facebook feed. And so you've gotten this kind of dispersion of sources, whereas, if you go back to 1965, everybody watched one of 3 newscasts, all of which were absolutely identical. Then we went to the cable world, and you had Fox, and people could see other things, and now the world has exploded beyond that. I want to distinguish here. There's not a lot. You read a lot of press, hear a lot about fake news. There's not a lot of that. That's the proportion of people who see fake news or share it, that's pretty low. So the question is just that they've got a more diverse flow of news, and they have choices. So you're all sitting here, and you're all well aware of what Trump's policies are versus other candidates' policies, and that's apparent to you. But you are free to only watch Fox News, or to only read Breitbart, or to only read anything you want on the right, and at that point you will have a very, very different view of the world. And I sort of hesitate to suggest this, but try it for a week. I've never managed to do it. It's difficult. But you will see a different world out there. So what are the effects of that? We're not exactly sure, in the sense that there's a large view that contributes to sort of affect polarization. White Democrats don't like Republicans and things. But it presents this different information environment to people. And so whereas you all know a whole lot about the world, there's a set of people now who are free not to.
Would anyone else like to come in on that one?
I mean, I guess what I would say is that politics is a constant process. That, we talk about sort of political generations, and each political generation is shaped by, what's happening around them, and also by socialization. And so that, yes, we're still talking about things in the same way 40 years later, but we're talking about slightly different things to new people. And so I think that that's part of the issue, is that I think we tend to want to believe that, we've got this issue settled, and that's not necessarily true. And so that it is a sort of politics is a constant struggle and change is a constant struggle. And that can be, I think, at points exhausting, but also possibly hopeful.
Next question.
So the demographics of our nation have distorted, I think, the Senate because it's set up clearly with the Congress being one way and the Senate being another. But in light of the way demographics have landed in the United States, it is now potentially disproportionately representing a group of people. And it's not clear that the system has a mechanism to actually address that. And if it doesn't get addressed, that feels to me over time to create a kind of a boiler situation. So what am I not seeing in terms of the opportunities for addressing what appears to be a structural problem in the way the U.S. system was set up?
I'll take it. Do I have to turn it? No. It's on, okay. I think that you're absolutely right, it's a structural problem. I don't think the structural problem is new, though. It was set up to represent agrarian slave-owning interests in 1789, and it still represents rural over urban. It represents sparse places over dense places. It is all based on the fiction that the states are in fact independent. The United States means 50 actors, and of course that's probably wasn't true then, and it definitely isn't true now. They're not independent actors, and it is a structural problem. I guess I'm rephrasing your remark in the form of just slightly different terms, but I think that it's an appropriate analysis. But I'm not an advocate of a new constitutional convention because I think that right now is too hard to implement.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that things change, and right now we're at a point, though, you think about political differences in the U.S. and you think about the characteristics of the small states that are overrepresented. They're not just small states; they tend to not have big cities in them and things. And if you look at the U.S. now, what's different? Well, the gap between big cities and every place else is growing. Look at where in the U.S. is it booming, where is it not booming? It's big cities versus places that are sparsely populated. So the difference in preferences is really, really stark now when you look at big states versus small states. And that makes what was fundamentally, an anti-democratic system to start with look that much worse. So we're in a bad spot with this now. It might get better in the long run, but in the short run, as long as those differences in preferences stay there, yeah, it's a bad problem.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think that's sort of interesting to think about is some of these spaces are also changing themselves internally. I mean, people have talked about the fact that the place where, for example, where Latino growth is at its fastest is in the U.S. South, right? So in some of these rural areas, you're seeing different kinds of populations. Now, when they become voters is going to take some time, right? So I think it's going to be, but the fundamental problems are fundamental and they're structural. And yeah, I'm terrified of a constitutional convention, sadly. But I also think that there's things that we should be, I think it's really important to be having a public conversation about the problems here. Like and the way that they are literally disenfranchising huge numbers of people. Like I think we should be talking about and raising issues of it. I think because we can't fix it doesn't mean we shouldn't be discussing the fundamental failure that the structure is right now. I think that's actually a point we should be discussing in the same way that we should be talking about getting rid of the Electoral College and really talking about what that means. And I think, but it won't change until we start putting it on the agenda to even be discussed and debated as a problem and tracing it back to slavery and really talking about what those histories are. I think if we can use it as an opportunity to sort of engage people in the larger histories of how these things evolved, that could be super useful.
And I just would add that, change is hard in terms of constitutions, but change can happen in a variety of ways. So right now, the issue of birthright citizenship is now on the table, and people say, and believe me, this is disturbing, but people say, no, it's not possible, look at the language. But then if you think about the ways in which the 14th Amendment was reinterpreted for many decades
Right.
to not apply to individual rights, but really to apply to corporations, the way the 15th Amendment was simply not enforced. That, you know, we have a constitutional system that in many ways can be tinkered with in ways that are not necessarily at the level of an actual constitutional amendment moment.
Next question.
I was going to ask about the two sides of this discussion, maybe not this one, but certainly what swirls around turnout elections, and that is the mobilization by political parties, by the consulting industry, to have a secure and steady population that can be predicted. And this, of course, is, you know, political scientists talk about this from E. Schatt-Snyder's system of 1896 going forward, but the versions of that, though they are different over time, still persist. So here we are, lots of mobilization, voting, etc. How are these industries and the parties handling or participating in this churn?
And I'll sort of take a shot at this in the sense that it is a competitive sport. You know, so there are campaigns on both sides, but there is, anyone who looks at it notices what seems to be this bias from the outside of the parties don't work as much to mobilize as we would think they would. But if you talk to campaign consultants and everything, they will just sort of say it's hard to do. And the ones who do it are the ones where they look at the numbers and it's like, oh, we won't win unless we increase the number of voters out there. So when you look at like Stacey Abrams' campaign in Georgia, it's like, well, why is she closed? Well, there's got to be a different set of people showing up to vote. And that's not an accident. I mean, that campaign was trying to do that. So I think campaigns do compete, and the, you know, my take is if the Democratic Party would run candidates with different platforms, different positions, they might increase turnout of a different set of people. As you say, there's a bit of a conservative bent there, and where they deviate it from is when, oh, we're going to lose it, we keep doing the same thing. And so you see, experimentation is just slow.
I was just thinking, you know, I'm forgetting the name of his book, but David Truman, political scientist, and talking about political interest. And I think one of the things is really, one thing I think Truman's insight actually is that interest is not stable. It's not a thing, right? People become politically interested, right? And so I think that's one of the challenges is that when it comes to measuring particular populations, there's a kind of stability to that, maybe that moment, like the question of how do we think about an electorate or a population that is becoming politically interested. And so it's not a question of simply having interests, it's deciding what your interests are. That's a process of a kind of political becoming, coming into a certain kind of political consciousness. And that's an ongoing process, right? And so that's why I think when people get, you know, sometimes feel frustrated, like, well, we've done this or we've tried this, it's like the touch points have to be so multiple and over time to build up. You know, if you think about your own families, if you've been political, often it's like, oh, my dad was a union guy. I mean, I think of my own family, it's like, my dad was a union guy, my grandfather was a union man, they read a daily paper, they've been voting for like 3 generations. Like, you know, that didn't just happen overnight. That didn't happen because somebody knocked on my door once and handed me a piece of paper, right? Like, that electorate, that was years of socialization to become a voter, right? So I think this question of how do people become interested and getting candidates that see themselves that way. I think right now we're seeing all these new people coming into, you know, running for office, and I think it's great that they're running for office, but I think they often see themselves as like, my new ideas and my experience will be this transformative event. And it's like, well, that's great, but the real transformative event is if you imagine your relationship to an electorate differently, right? And so we need a politics that can help people imagine themselves as candidates having a different kind of dynamic with a changing electorate, and I don't think we've had that conversation like nearly enough.
I mean, just to add on to that, I mean, I think one of the things is it's political learning by the campaign consultants as well. So that if you have a system that's based on, you know, getting the union vote out, but unions are starting to disappear, and then, oh, you've gone after the teachers. And so all these ways in which we knew how to sort of get people to come together and talk about politics, those kinds of spaces are changing or disappearing. And so the political entrepreneur, the successful one, will go out and find where are the new spaces that politics is being discussed and how do we connect them. So, I mean, this could just be me and my age, but I know that the sort of pantsuit nation, and I'm in New Jersey 11, which has been this district where a great, attractive candidate managed to persuade the incumbent to actually retire. And that, I think, a lot of it was through social media. And so that connected people who were passionately interested in politics to people who were sort of not that interested, and brought them together. So I think, again, it's a process of learning that each new election, in some ways, you have to figure out what are the interests and where are the people, and then connect them together.
Great. There was another question over here.
Around 15 years ago, I think an article or a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority came out. And I remember it, and I think the basic thesis was that the Republican coalition at the time was much older and much whiter, and that the predictable demographic trends that were coming in the future would lead to a electorate that was much more likely to lead to this sort of sustained Democratic majority. And I'm not sure exactly what the time frame was on that book. I think, based on what I know about the demography, the demographic changes are happening and continue to happen, but the political changes, it does not seem have happened. So I'm curious if you could comment on that, why the political changes haven't happened. Is it a problem with the thesis? Is it a problem with the time frame, or?
Can I, that's a great question. I just wanted to sort of follow it up a little bit before I turn it over to you, because The Emerging Democratic Majority, of course, is a book that was written as a play on a book from '68 called The Emerging Republican Majority by Kevin Phillips, which, if you read it, I bought it 2 years ago, and had, not being a specialist of American politics, didn't know about it beforehand, but a lot of the things seem very prescient, and prescient not in a way like, oh, this is how Richard Nixon got elected, but this is how Trump could get elected. So maybe the four of you could each take a crack at sort of what's the relevance of the logic behind the emerging Democratic majority, but also is there still logic behind what was said by Phillips in terms of the emerging Republican majority?
I just want to take it, in terms of the emerging Democratic majority, the problem with the thesis is it assumes the parties never change positions or don't adapt to this, and they do. The idea that, well, the Republican Party is going to, if you just look at the demographics, the Republican Party will lose the next election, and the election after that, and the election after that. Well, parties don't do that. They don't play this, if they see their game is going to be a losing game, they don't continue to play it. And so the Republican Party has adapted. And the Republican Party has also done some odd things, and I think talking about the Republican Party is a bad move here, because, we always tell our students there are 50 of them, we got 50 states, and as I always like to say, Donald Trump is not a Republican, so, but the party has, basically what was wrong with the thesis is the party has adapted. Having said that, it is still, there are other things going on here that, well, Democrats haven't turned out to vote, and yada, yada, yada. But I think the biggest thing is that A, the Republican Party adapted to some extent, and B, the Democratic Party has not held its lock on some sets of voters as that book prophesized.
I'd emphasize voter suppression and gerrymandering. I think that Republicans believed that book and did what they could to change it. Number one was to hold down turnout among the most Democratic constituencies, and in the driver's license requirements and other things that were enacted did hold down vote disproportionately for the groups that the Democrats were supposed to benefit from. And gerrymandering produces congressional majorities in states. Pennsylvania, what's the figure in Pennsylvania? Before the recent redistricting, something like Democrats got over 50% of the vote in 3 House seats. And that's been rectified to some extent by the new map. But there's a North Carolina map that's under contestation. There was an Oklahoma and Texas maps that were contested in the courts, and and the Wisconsin map is crazy. I don't think that one's been worked its way through the courts yet, but that's a crazy one too. I think that's their response. work with the hand you're dealt, and they're winning with it.
I would say that Christine and I were literally just talking about this book this afternoon, so I'm going to let Christine do Christina. But what I would add is that I think that we are in this moment of backlash in the sense of let's try to sort of lock in political power. How long will that last? I don't think it'll actually last all that long because it's tough to kind of keep that up on a sort of election year in and year out. But I also think that Republicans and Democrats learned, right? So that prior to, I'd say, 2016, you actually had Republican governors who actually developed pretty diverse coalitions. I mean, Chris Christie. I mean, he had a significant Latino support and African American support. So, I mean, I think that I don't think demography is destiny, and I think the authors of that book kind of made that assumption, and I think that was a little too broad, provocative, but I think a little too broad and a little too deterministic.
Yeah, we were just saying demography is not destiny, and that book really has a dream of that the numbers grow, and then these electoral groups just sort of emerge, as opposed to having to be cultivated and the complexities. I'm writing a book on Latino conservatives, and so one of the things that people were shocked by was that Donald Trump, well, the CNN exit poll said 29%, groups like Latino Decisions said it was more like 18%. It's probably typical. It was, Romney got 25% of the Latino vote. There's about a quarter of Latino voters who are conservative. They just are. They vote for Republicans. Then there's about 65% of Latino voters who are pretty much Democrats. And then there's this maybe 15% that sort of is the ones that got, Bush over to 40 or something. But there's a certain group of swing voters, but it's not overall a swingy electorate. It's established on both sides in certain ways. So I think that but I think that one of the issues though is we need to think about multiracial conservatism, right? And that those are also, people are being, there's a story to be told here about Trump and whiteness, but there's also a story here about other people who are being hailed into that kind of Trump coalition, who are taking pleasure in those kinds of politics, who are also from non-white communities. And I think that's something that still needs to really get theorized. And also in the same way that we were saying before that, I was saying Latinos are not one thing. Well, white voters aren't one thing either. And that's also one of the interesting, I think one of the ways we talk about the sort of increase in intense partisanship has to do with the fact that the white vote itself is splitting in this particular way, where you have a certain set of white voters who are doubling down on a certain notion of whiteness in the Trump coalition, and then another group of white voters who are appalled by this, and it's pushing them off and it's galvanizing them in a different direction. So I think we have to sort of talk about that story of what's happening. And I think for a lot of white nativists, that's actually really frustrating, right? That whiteness isn't even doing what it used to do. So they're watching marches, and so they're not feeling like it's as secure as they would like it to be in that way either. So I think all of these forces in which you have multiracial groups getting hailed into conservatisms and certain forms of whiteness, and other groups of people who are critiquing it, it's creating far more interesting coalitions and gatherings of voters than that book.
Mike wanted to come back on that one, but it looks like Kimberly, you'd like to come back on that as well.
Just one little point, which you didn't mention, which is assimilation.
Yeah.
That you could be a second or third generation Latino or immigrant and decide, I'm an American.
Right.
Maybe not white, but maybe American.
And the amount of interracial marriage in Latino and Asian American communities is also, so you're gonna, there's always this debate in Latino politics of are Latinos gonna be more like African Americans as a racial group, or are they gonna become like an ethnic group like Italians? And the answer is yes.
Right.
They're gonna do both. And so watching that happen in different states and spaces is gonna be interesting, yeah.
I just wanted to say that the Phillips book, the Kevin Phillips book, The Emerging Republican Majority, was not a demography as destiny. What his analysis was is that we have three political parties in this country, the Northern Democrats, the Southern Democrats, and the Republicans, and with their civil rights agenda, the Democrats are, and this was with Hubert Humphrey's speech in '48, not the Civil Rights Act, the Northern Democrats are going after Northern Republicans who are Party of Lincoln Republicans, and the only way to counter that is to win that third party, the Southern Democrats, and so the Nixon Southern strategy. So it was a more geography than demography strategy.
Right, I was
So-
thinking about the
yeah,
Teixeira
so I'd
book.
be
I was
d-
thinking about the Teixeira book. but
Yeah, so do you think the Southern strategy still applies, even if it's no longer specific, probably predominantly in the South, but certainly not only, if you think about where?
I think because of the demographic changes in the South, that you can't win the South, you can't count on winning the South anymore without voter suppression, and that the Obama election, especially in 2008, proved that.
I mean, I think what I would say is that the Republican Party of, say, Nixon through maybe Bush 1 was really, in some ways, an unstable party. I mean, it really was sort of three kind of subgroups. It was sort of the Reagan kind of left, the Reagan sort of California group, the sort of Southerners, and then the sort of, the remnant of the sort of Rockefeller Republicans. There are no more Rockefeller Republicans. There's poor Susan Collins up in Maine who's like, and so, I mean, so the Southern strategy in some ways becomes the Republican Party, and that even the sort of fiscal and military hawks kind of, I mean, those are like in some ways the never Trumpers. They've gotten pushed out. So I think that the Republican Party today it's a different party than Bush 1 and certainly Bush 2, where people like, the elders who are supposedly going to sort of manage GW are not even part of the conversation. They really are not. They've just sort of pushed that away.
We've got time for a couple more questions if anybody wants to step in.
Hi, I have two questions. First is, what's the impact of worsening polarization on people's willingness to vote? The second is, what's the difference of strategies used by two parties to motivate people? Thanks.
Okay, so first question's on what's the effect of polarization on people's willingness to vote. And second question is about what are the different strategies used by the two parties actually currently.
Yeah,
So the polarization question, I guess it sort of could relate to some of the things that Jonathan was saying in his talk, that if people don't know what the difference is between the two candidates, they're probably less likely to vote. But as things become more polarized, you would think that people would eventually be able to figure that out. So I don't know if you have a...
Yeah, I think that the first wave of strategy, I think that the get out the vote, mobilize the base theories of, dominated the 2004 and 2008 elections and the midterms on either side of those. But that beginning in the 2010 midterm, where the Tea Party organized itself independent of the Republican Party and articulated issues in a new and novel way and mobilized people who weren't previously mobilized, I think opened the door to that, and that Trump's anti-immigration policy was basically opening he was, in a certain way, he's an issue entrepreneur who has identified a couple of things that polarize people's thinking in ways that cut across the traditional party labels and are producing what for him are good results and what for others are not.
I mean, I think what I would say is that I think that one of the comments that you hear from, I think, particularly Republicans is that I didn't leave the Republican Party left me. And so I think for those folks, will this sort of political polarization be enough to sort of get them over the line to vote against their party, or do they just sort of sit home? And I think we saw a little bit of in the Alabama election, where they couldn't bring themselves to vote for the Republican candidate, so they voted for the third party candidate in some ways. And so I think we're still in that moment where I think the people who feel that they don't have a choice because of the way that polarization has occurred are perhaps not participating. But I also think, and I brought it here and I didn't bring it up to stage, is that at least in the flyers that I get in New Jersey, the election materials are literally this is a vote on Trump. And if you vote against the candidate who's in my district, the Republican candidate, you're voting against Trump. So there's a way in which this election is and it really depends. In some districts, it's sort of nationalized, and in other districts, I think Democratic candidates are having a very sort of close, attention to issues like healthcare, and not necessarily making it a vote on Trump because they might not win that way.
So some of our panelists are running on a tight schedule, and I want to make sure not to go over, but we've got time for one more question if someone would like to.
We didn't answer his second.
Well, I thought Kimberly just about the different strategies used by the.
Okay, I started it, I will end it. The Southern strategy, in one sense, is gone, and there is a new strategy, and it's the immigration strategy. It's very clear what we've seen in the last, since the Muslim ban. So I'd like to have you project, it's unfair to do that, to where the immigration strategy goes, regardless of what happens on Tuesday in the 2020 presidential election.
Well, and also, as part of that, I'd like to hear, do you think it's going to be, it'll be successful with some people, but sort of broadly successful or not successful with the way it's being used on the Republican end?
It's really interesting because actually larger data sets like Gallup polls and other things show that that anti-immigrant sentiment's actually down nationally. Right, the numbers are, I think something like, it was at a high of like 65% of people were concerned about immigration in like the mid-90s, 96 or so. Now it's down to 35. It's, I think, the lowest since Gallup's begun taking the poll. So what's interesting is, on the whole, Americans are not particularly galvanized by immigration, but this particular segment of conservatives are highly mobilized by it. So I think so it's simultaneously galvanizing that segment and turning off a lot of other voters. So I think the question I keep having now is like, what this election is going to be about? What do we hate more, Trump or immigrants? Right? It's like that's kind of what this is coming down to at some level. And so I think that I think it'll continue though. I think nativism has a really deep, potent strain in American public life right now, and I think it has a lot to do with things like growing wealth inequality. And anxieties around sovereignty and anxiety around membership and belonging. And so I think I think some of those concerns are actually legitimate. The way they're being articulated is really wrong-headed and horrible. But I think that's one of the tasks, I think, for us politically right now, is to think about how can a legitimate concern be sort of nested in a toxic logic. And I think nativism is one of those things where there's a lot of, it's a toxic racist logic, but it often involves concerns about real issues that actually do involve real political problems that this country's failed to solve, and they've sort of just gotten mapped on the bodies of migrants. And so.
I think I would just add, Brazil just elected someone who is, so it's a global thing. It's what's the wave of sort of nativist or xenophobic leaders or parties in Europe, India, Brazil. So I think it is a global moment that we're in, and I would argue that in some ways it's the collapse of this sort of neoliberal consensus. Yeah. And so we are literally living in history, and this is sort of a rethinking of all sorts of different things, the sort of global political order, the global sort of defense order. Where's China? I think that it's much more than this election, and this election is simply a reflection of this broader global reordering that's happening.
And I would just say real quick, I think that's also why I think it's going to be really incumbent upon Democrats to not just be the party of let's get back to normal, right? Because normal felt broken to a lot of people, so we're going to have to articulate another model that somehow draws from the best of some of those legacies and really confront some of the problems.
Yeah, if you haven't felt normal since 1985, it's hard. I do want to emphasize, though, that is something, now I've forgotten who said it, but that the national polls do show most Americans are welcoming to immigrants, and that resentment against immigrants is down, and that worries about Mexican Americans and Mexican immigration is on the wane. And I believe Trump actually recognizes this, which is why the caravan is a vector of disease and Muslim invasion, not a vector of Mexican hard work. And
George Soros.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Don't
an
forget
anti-
that.
yeah, well, you
Anti-Semitism.
can't get very far without an anti-Semitic spike.
Yeah.
But I think that part of how it gains political leverage and keeps morphing and evolving is that it cuts across the polarization that we were discussing earlier. It's a potent new issue for those who say it first, because it brings people who were in either the inactive or the Democratic column into the Republican column. And until there's an answer on the left that isn't just let's get back to normal, it will continue to get traction. And it will continue, the message will continue to change. The message will continue to move in the direction that they're getting their traction from. And they'll learn, both sides will learn from this election. And therefore 2020 will be different from 2018, just as 18 has been different from 16.
Okay, well, come back and join us on Friday the 16th at 5 p.m. to find out what the explanation is for what happened, whatever is going to happen. I'd like to thank our panelists. Thanks and good night, everybody.